My name is Noah Kulwin. I am a podcaster, a writer, and a journalist. I co-host Blowback podcast, a political history show that is now in its 5th season. And earlier this year, I also contributed an essay to From the River to the Sea, the ebook collection issued by Verso. I think Joe Biden's legacy is going to be really bad. Like, it's going to be really funny. Like, I think, to me, he's kind of the American Buchanan, the original James Buchanan, not the economist, but the president. Slave owners in the South hated him because he thought that they didn't do enough to protect their cherished institutions. And the North hated him because they thought he was giving the kitchen sink and appeasing, bending over backward to appease the South. And obviously he's now known as the shitty president that we had before Lincoln. While I don't think that Donald Trump will be viewed as Lincoln, I do think that the things that sort of make Buchanan like 150 years later, even among people who have including myself, if we're being honest, like a pretty passing familiarity with the events in the prehistory of the Civil War, like you have the same kind of like magical quality of being completely disliked by everybody. Which in America is, quite an accomplishment because even George W. Bush gets a rehab job after a few years. I don't think that rehab job will come for Joe Biden, partly because he won't live long enough to charm people back onto his side, but also because, these years, like at least you could say about 2000s, right? Even if they preceded the financial crash, essentially, they were years of plenty for America. There's always years of pain and people who suffer in this country, but like those are remembered and felt to have been good times. We are in fact going through waves of cultural nostalgia for it right now. There are television programs, the entire premise of which is just that it's full of cultural references from the 2000s. Like it's nostalgia tours. Like that's how people view that time. I do not feel that is how people are going to remember the Biden years. People may feel that way about the rent that they paid in 2019, but I don't think that they'll feel that way about Joe Biden. I think that they're going to feel that he was the guy who, if not directly made everything worse, which he had a hand in, he will be the guy whom they associate with everything getting much, much worse in a more subtle way than, the Donald Trump being president. I think that the second Trump presidency will be received very differently by the opposition than the first Trump presidency. And I use opposition pretty broadly here because in 2016 and 2017, there was a rather stunningly large countermobilization to Trump from what we could consider like the organized left, trade unions, DSA, other socialist organizations or socialist aligned groups. And you also had that, sort of almost in like a popular front formation, it seemed on the surface, with, more standard liberal civil society groups or with a donor establishment class, billionaires and hedge funders or others with really, really deep pockets that fund, liberal nonprofits and so on, and who are revolted, or horrified by Trump. And that counter-mobilization was meaningful and deep, and I think people, because of how quickly it seemed it all went away with the pandemic and with the election of a Democratic president and so on, people forget how swift and meaningful it was. I do not think that we are going to have that same kind of counter-mobilization this time. I do not think that we are going to have the same volume or intensity of protests in the streets. While I don't think that Trump is going to announce something flashy and crazy like a Muslim ban, I do think that he will announce something flashy and crazy like something else that will largely feel like a whack across the back to an already pretty, defeated and demobilized political opposition. The idea that Trump could win in 2016 and that he did win was not incorrectly viewed as a fluke. He barely got into the office, and it was largely because of manifold mistakes by Hillary Clinton. This time around, I think people feel it's a little bit, like maybe it's 1984, not the Orwell book, but the actual year. Maybe this is actually a time when conservative values and ideas and mores are in ascendancy here. I don't really quite believe that myself, but I do believe that there is a sense of defeat that has come with not just this election, but this election as sort of the cherry on top of like a year and a half in which all sorts of different progressive policy priorities were abandoned at the wayside. All in all, I think that there is, again, it'll be defeated, it'll be less active, but I don't think that means that like the left is dead or that it'll be inert. But I also, it's instead a function of both that people are defeated and so forth, yes, but also that people remember the skin deep quality of much of that counter-mobilization in 2016 and 2017. That marching in the streets, walking up and down Fifth Avenue, didn't necessarily change things. In fact, it maybe, it gave the impression that things could change because you got so many people out doing all this, out in the street, voting with their feet or whatever. But instead, it really just, it was just one more phenomenon. People's lives weren't meaningfully upended in the long run by the nature of that counter-mobilization last time. Flash in the pan. And as a consequence, people now, I think, are, they care about, of those who are engaged, of the minority who are activated and mobilized and who remain engaged years later in sustained, let's say, like left political activity, the horizons are probably different. They're probably thinking along the scale of, like years and, like many years, and not just at the, like, well, how do we get the country back on track by electing better people in office next cycle and the cycle after. I don't think that that's how people think anymore. And, my optimism, to the extent that I have any about, that kind of, about the structure of left political dissent in this country, is that there are people who are conscious that making things that can like last and that have integrity and that cannot be so easily assimilated into or compromised by, the mainstream political outlets of this country. I think that's, those are durable. Those are ideally durable roots for something more meaningful in the future. I think that history will show Palestine to have had a decisive impact on the election. Not in the sense that it was Palestine in the active minds of voters on election day, but I think it was decisive in that Palestine showed that no matter how far Kamala Harris tried to run from the Biden administration, she never really could get that far. Not just because of inflation, mind you, but also because of what is now the signature foreign policy of the Biden-Harris administration, which is support for the Israeli genocide in Gaza. And Harris's unwillingness to break from that consensus, to break from that policy, is to me illustrative of how Palestine's impact was felt in this election, which is that it wasn't talked about, it wasn't engaged with, it wasn't put into the minds of voters, but all the same, it was perfectly reflective of the consensus with which Harris refused to break. I think from a second Trump term, we can expect that Palestine, or rather Palestinians, will continue to suffer. There are fears and concerns, credible fears and concerns at this stage, that Trump will try to formally or allow for the formal annexation of the West Bank and Gaza into Israel, territories which the Israeli government and settlers call Judea and Samaria. I should also add Bill Clinton evidently calls them by those names as well. However, I do believe that the Trump administration will find itself somewhat hamstrung in finding ways to more enthusiastically support Israel than the Biden administration has done. The things that the Trump administration put most of its political capital into the first time around in helping the Israeli government, those are no longer available as opportunities. The Abraham Accords, for example, this idea of normalizing Israeli relations with all of its neighboring Arab states, that's not possible anymore. Mohammed bin Salman has directly said publicly that Israel's committing a genocide. There are even signs of a broader Saudi-Iranian rapprochement in the making, though we shouldn't get too ahead of ourselves. The point being that the Trump administration last time sought to serve as Israel's backing bloc in the Middle East and tried to build up all of this diplomatic leverage and support for it, moving the American embassy to Jerusalem and so forth. I am not sure how much gas is left in the tank. I think that while the reality on the ground for Palestinians will remain miserable and brutal, that Palestinians in the West Bank who may have had their lives not totally upended by the events of the last year and change, things may get worse and more unstable for them. It is hard for me to imagine at this point, however, what it is that the Trump administration is able to offer Israel. And that's just simply a consequence of how off the rails the Israeli government has gone since October 2023. The second Trump term is shaping up to be something like the third George W. Bush term. I think the announcements and personnel that have been made already suggest that the Trump administration is really little more in its foreign policy imagination than, a neoconservative wet dream. It is everything that people at the Center for a New American Security and Foundation for Defense of Democracy, it's everything that these right-wing think tanks have been hoping and praying for. Unfortunately for them, I do not believe that their dreams will necessarily mesh quite well with reality. I do not believe that they will be able to affect all of the regime change that they want. I do not think that the American polity's appetite for foreign wars by American soldiers and forces is frankly all that high. However, that doesn't mean that there won't be really noxious and terrible efforts and fundamental intensifications of some very bad existing policy. It is not clear at this stage how the Trump administration plans to wind down the war in Ukraine. It is not clear how the Trump administration thinks that it is going to pursue the same kind of adventurism in Latin America now that there are a bunch of governments in Latin America that do not support the Trump administration, whether it's in Mexico, Colombia, or Brazil. All in all, the Trump foreign policy is shaping up to be very hawkish. There aren't really silver linings. There is simply, the way I would think of it is that it's going to be another very bloody, very bad chapter in a book that's, been in the process of being written for many decades now. Trump is not a major redirection or a realignment of American policy and American power, to borrow the thesis of my friend Tim Barker. It is instead an intensification of existing policies and existing negative impulses, to put it kindly, within the American political system. And the rest of the world is essentially going to have to pay that blood tax. What it looks like exactly at this stage, who can say? The struggle for Palestine on a popular level under a Trump presidency is at this moment, at least based on the conversations that I've had with people in the movement and people who work for organizations that support pro-Palestinian dissent in this country, the fear is that the Trump administration will use instruments of state repression to clamp down on pro-Palestinian dissent. But as I was just saying, a lot of this will be an intensification of existing measures. For example, the Biden administration's designation of Samidun as a material supporter of terrorism. These are the sort of things that I think are most concerning from what people I know talk about, at least these are the things that keep people up at night. The idea that being an organized pro-Palestinian organization, a nonprofit, let's say you sell a t-shirt with a slogan that's a little racy and somebody doesn't like it. Could that, as the dominoes fall, lead to your organization being marked a foreign support, a supporter of a foreign terrorist organization? It's not as sexy sounding as necessarily, I think, people getting, clubbed at protests, and doesn't fit quite in the same sort of imaginary imagination of American popular protest. But it does seem that the Trump administration has been playing with, like they're in the position to pick up and use tools that the Biden people were playing with to suppress pro-Palestinian speech. I think that'll be a recurring fear, if not a headline outright, in the coming years. That said, I also would say that the popular struggle, it's going to be conditioned by a lot of what happened in the past year, in the course of the fall of 2023 and throughout 2024. Universities and large institutions in America successfully clamped down on pro-Palestinian dissent. Protests took place at universities and college campuses and in institutions of all stripes across the country. And I think by this point, Americans have seen somebody of every profession type fired for a pro-Palestine belief. A nurse, a police officer, a teacher, a college professor, municipal employees, state government employees, carpenter somewhere, I'm sure. It's the nature of it. People have found that there are swift and meaningful consequences, and although chilling effect tends to be a legal cliche to describe the impact of speech restrictions, I think what we see now very much is a real, true hesitancy from people to speak out about the issue. And under a Trump administration, the omerta, the McCarthyite quality of this, the neo-HUAC that they may try to create to address this, ridiculous circumstance, all of that is within the realm of possibility to me. But I would emphasize and I would give primacy to the idea that the Trump administration will be focused on figuring out how to punish nonprofits and other organized groups using the legal tools that have been developed over the past few years, and especially in the last year by the Biden administration. Yep. Well, the good thing for the United States is that its position in the world is bigger than any presidency. The bad news for the United States is that its position in the world is bigger than any presidency. Joe Biden inherited a United States with a lot of very fundamental questions about the quality and stability of its political and economic order. The ruling class of our country, as was sort of laid bare by the great financial crash, have since the dawn of neoliberalism been sort of primarily focused on generating wonderful, large, healthy and fat returns, no matter what the cost to the rest of the country. Whether it's the the ever worse quality of many features of American life, whether it's public transit or the costs that people have to pay for medical care or whatever, you name it. The frailness of that order and the lack of ideological buy-in from people for its sustained liberalism devoid of content is, I think, how a lot of people, not incorrectly, are now identifying this kind of reality, at least as how, at least the ideological reality of America today. That's also how people saw things prior to 2020, and it's how they've seen them in 2024. I don't think that there was anything in the Biden years that really changed that perception of America as a place whose, ruling order is in, rather substantial jeopardy. That is, sort of riven with contradictions about its commitments to liberty, equality, perpetual prosperity, peace and loving kindness for man, and all that. And the rather sort of constant violence, both at home and abroad, and austerity that's required to keep the whole damn thing going. When Joe Biden leaves office in January 2025, he's going to leave behind a country that is, on those fundamental questions, I think, pretty unchanged. The CHIPS Act, Bidenomics, these attempts to reorganize American domestic policy along new lines, along a kind of more strategically rebalanced set of industries with a bolstered manufacturing sector and a lot of things that were previously made in other countries now being made here and so forth. It's not enough. It's something like being, in a 20-foot deep hole and only having a 5-foot ladder. You're still stuck down there. And so I don't think that there's really a kind of, like a way that the rest of the world, because they have brains too, they've got eyes, they see what's going on. I don't think that their perception of our reality, I don't think that they see it as any different. I think to some, Trump probably looks like a savior in the way that he does to Americans here as well. He's got friends abroad. But I think to a lot of others, and I think to many people who've always viewed America with a more skeptical eye, Trump and his election on either side of the Biden years looks like a death rattle. And Joe Biden, in his like physical body, also sort of represents that death rattle. And I'm not really sure that had even somebody more young and vital like Kamala been elected, that it really would have changed that perception either. I think that Ukraine's impact on the election is harder to trace because it did not map onto a particularly easy or comfortable partisan split among like the power elite. Among like voters and in the media, right? Like Democrat war, Republican opposition, pretty simple. But as we are now seeing, the Republican administration in power is beginning to take shape and suggest that its Ukraine policy will not be dramatically different from what Biden's was. With that said, saying that it was like a kind of existing polarized like media divide about it, I don't think that, unlike Gaza, where Americans have been, and not just Americans is really the wrong way to phrase this one. Like, people around the world have been bombarded with images of the dead and wounded and suffering in Palestine and in Lebanon. I don't think that the consciousness of the Ukraine conflict is quite in that level. Like, yes, people have seen images of Russia attacking Ukrainian buildings, of civilian population centers being targeted, and so forth. But I think that the idea of, Ukrainians being good guys we can back, and Ukraine being a place that fits comfortably within the American imaginary of a Western ally, I just don't feel, to me at least, it didn't seem like something that really divided or messed with the electorate all that much. I don't think that there were a lot of people who, in fact, I actually know people who were directly affected in a rather negative way and who are extraordinarily, anti-Putin, but who, and I'm speaking anecdotally purely here, of course, but who, were always going to vote for Trump. And the Ukraine war, completely upended these people's lives, and it doesn't seem to be much of an issue for them that Trump at least was publicly posturing like, oh my God, Zelensky's, he's ripping off our country. Why are we supporting these Ukrainians? Putin never would have invaded if I were president of this, that, and the other. Like, it seems that there was like at least, I don't know if people just believed that when Trump got in office, he would do something different, and so they held up their nose, or if it just was not that important an issue to them. But I do think what does alarm me is the idea that, America can get involved in a really substantial proxy war like it has in Ukraine, and even, with some credible evidence, be reported to have done things like blow up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to sever Germany from cheap Russian gas. And it doesn't register in the American political consciousness. Like, that's actually kind of alarming, because it does suggest that America can do quite a bit to still throw its weight around in the world, and its own population will be bamboozled or none the wiser about what the real impact its government does have elsewhere in the world is. It's hard to say what the changes within Europe may be vis-a-vis NATO. Partly because the changes in Europe at a population or at a political level are kind of still, like, those convulsions are still happening. Germany in particular, I think, is in the middle of a particularly complicated political transformation that is resulting from an astonishingly rapid deindustrialization. The consequences of all of this, both which parties come into power, what their positions were in opposition versus what they will be in power. AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, the far-right populist party that has risen to prominence in Germany in recent years, It could be not dissimilar to what happened with Giulia Meloni in Italy, where they talk this, rather extravagant game about NATO and not being played for suckers by foreign powers and all that. But then once in power, are essentially happy to pick up the continuity, at least as far as NATO is concerned, with the predecessors in office. So we'll see. I don't know enough about the particulars of the different NATO countries internally to kind of go, do like a blow by blow of where they are. I just brought up Germany because it's the biggest and most relevant country when we talk about this stuff. I think as far as America's relationship to Europe goes, we're in a little of like a kind of mini trade war in the U.S. where we are reinvesting in industrial capacity in a way that will affect the American quality of life, I think, like at the margins. It'll be meaningful, but like it's going to be felt. I mean, like it will be meaningful at the margins. It's a real change, but the main way that it will be felt is obviously in the actual structure of the products and that we build, and the fact that most of those things are not going to just be consumed by our domestic markets, but are also going to be exported to our next biggest foreign market, or at least in Europe. Like there is a really clear, at least to me, kind of game that, like somewhat risky game we're playing, whereby we are pursuing this kind of strategic reinvestment while at the same time encouraging in Europe a kind of a schizophrenic idea of what their economy should be and what it should be doing. It should be not too industrially competitive with our own, because I'm not so sure that would work out for our own native industry. But also, we are now in the middle of, this grand American great power conflict with China. And Europe has, a rather complicated relationship now with China, as also Europe still does with Russia. Two very large trading partners of the last 20 years, with which all of a sudden it's now supposed to be moving in a totally different direction. I generally view that whatever will happen with NATO is going to be, it's going to develop kind of, like hand in hand with whatever these questions about international political economy, with however they get resolved. Whether Germany, whether NATO, because one way, very obvious way that Europe reconciles a lot of this deindustrialization and tries to shore itself up is by doing like learning something from their American cousins and using a lot of industrial what we or pursuing rather a policy of industrial reinvestment that's focused on the military. Because Lord knows there are enough battlefields in the world right now to absorb all this stuff, and diplomats who are happy to find new markets for these weapons to go, and so forth. I don't know how NATO will shake out in the coming years. It's also the second largest standing army in NATO is not a European army, it's Turkey's army. And so there is also a question about, is NATO going to be synonymous with European defense in the future in the way that it has been in the past? I think, these are the kinds of questions that I'm thinking about, at least. Particularly seeing as I don't believe that NATO does face a, land war threat from Putin, in the aggregate. It's what NATO will come to exist for, is ultimately, I think, that'll be the best way that we can understand it. Does it exist for, a defense compact that's going to be supplying weapons and looking for war zones and client governments to give those weapons to and put the weapons in, the way that the Americans have, on a grander scale? And by the way, European governments do this already. I'm not describing a new thing, but will it be intensified? I could see a world in which that's the case, that after a decade of supposed NATO backlash, we just have its, a rather intense reconsecration of it, but no longer as an Atlanticist defense project, or at least cast that way, but now cast as a rather more offensive, quote unquote, pro-democracy, pro-Western force. The American relationship with Cuba in recent years has had one very big up and then one continuing downslide. In the second term Obama administration, there were concrete steps taken toward normalization. And the lesson of that was absorbed in Washington was no lesson. It was abandoned, it was forgotten about, it was discarded with after 2016. Part of that is because one of the most powerful organized lobbies in any part of the country is the Cuban American lobby, primarily based out of South Florida, but we could say with a satellite in Washington, D.C. The Cuban American lobby is more or less the story of the modern Republican Party. Jeb Bush and the Bush family, if anything, is actually kind of an interesting proxy for the Cuban American lobby's influence in Washington politics. These are people who oppose the Cuban government at any and all cost. In an earlier era, a generation ago, in my lifetime, they carried out terrorist attacks to this effect on Cuban people on the mainland, or on the island rather, and in American domestic politics, because Florida was for so many years seen as a swing state, there was a certain amount of fealty paid to these people, paid to organized anti-Cuba lobbyists who, in some cases, were agitating for restoration of family-owned enterprises and properties, and in other instances are simply, more sucklings at the Cold War teat. I think now, after the Biden administration failed to, reverse any of the very obvious Trump reversals of the Obama thaw, because Biden didn't go back to try and restore the Obama thaw at all, Cuba's in a very difficult position. It's frankly not dissimilar to what it was before 2016, except now the Cuban society and economy is more connected with the world and more connected with Cuban expatriates in America, for example, than it ever has been. The Cuban government has made major reforms and major efforts to connect Cuba to the rest of the world where possible. And this has become increasingly important now that Cuba, particularly in this year, has been battered by hurricane after hurricane and has become reliant on the outside world to help, prop up core functions of the country. Mexico, Russia, Vietnam, other historic allies of Cuba, other historic friends of Cuba, have all sent aid, have all sent support, and have promised more. But the Trump administration that is arriving may yet be the most anti-Cuban and the most destructive to Cuba of any administration in recent years. The presumptive Secretary of State nominee for Trump, Marco Rubio, he seems like a lock for confirmation. I think it would be very difficult for him not to get confirmed. And he is himself a Cuban American, whose parents, by the way, did not leave under Castro, but left under the dictator who preceded him, Batista, though they may style themselves a bit differently as anti-communist dissidents. Rubio obviously is, he is an anti-Cuba hardliner and as nutty as they come. The sanctions that our government has in place on Cuba, which are on an annual basis condemned by the entire voting body of the UN, with the exception of the United States and Israel. The American sanctions that are the primary inhibitor to the development, growth, and flourishing of Cuba, those sanctions will remain in their currently intensified state left by Trump. And he will pick that up, I am sure, in some measure. Cuba and the Cuban government and the people are rather resilient, and they are supported by many, many other governments around the world. And so while I do not, fear for the island of Cuba in that grand sense, it's essentially an island of millions of people that the American government tortures as a measure of policy. We restrict fuel aid, we restrict the countries that can do business there, we make it there are all sorts of sanctions that I'm sure that we are not even aware of that we carry out, because that is just how onerous and developed and ripe the American sanctions regime is. Under Trump, Again, it is likely that this will be re-intensified, that the active diplomatic overtures to support dissent in Cuba aimed at destabilizing the government, that will probably also return in some measure, although more recently that happened under Biden. All in all, I would say that we are not going to have a particularly, at minimum, we are going to have a time where Cubans are going to suffer because of American indifference. But what is more likely and worse is that Cubans are going to suffer because of active American policy, which will go in new directions that we do not yet know. I think we are getting all sorts of information every day now, it feels like, about the ways in which voters and Americans in general were dissatisfied with, how to put it, not just the economy, but like the status quo. There's a truism in politics that people vote for status quo or change. And if the status quo is good, they'll vote for the status quo. If the change looks more promising and is good because they don't like the status quo, then they'll vote for the change. And that simple formulation sort of sheds like, oh, well, who is the status quo candidate? Who is the change candidate? Did people like the status quo? Do they want change? And if you think in those kinds of like simple terms, I think this election is pretty explicable in that way. And what it would suggest, continuing to use these terms, is, well, how could Kamala Harris, vice president of the incumbent, have rebranded herself or repositioned herself as a candidate of change? I believe that had Kamala Harris chosen to and had strategized around a meaningful break with the Biden administration on the policy in Gaza, I believe that could have been the beginning of that kind of rebrand into a candidate for change that would have had a meaningful impact. While voters and others were largely, it's not a cliche for nothing that voters and people in general are motivated by direct economic realities or indirect economic realities, by which I mean perceptions of how the economy and their place in it is functioning. I think that people also, as we are also getting told by, these reams of information coming out of this election, is that there really also, wasn't an attempt from Harris to, working within that framework, actively tell a story about why what she would do would be a positive change from the status quo. Yes, it's hard for a vice president to run away from the president she campaigned with, which suggests that maybe we shouldn't have had a candidate Harris at all. But I do believe that there is only one issue among the panoply of things going on that Harris could have used to stage that kind of break. And I believe it could have even been something negotiated with the administration itself. In the last month of the campaign, Biden released a letter saying that he was going to cut off arms to Israel in 30 days if they didn't make certain changes with aid distribution. 30 days pass. Israel makes no changes to the aid distribution. The U.S. relents anyway. It was a campaign stunt. Something they announced in October to make it seem like, oh, well, we're trying to get the ceasefire, we're trying to stop the bloodletting and so on, because they were conscious that it was having they were conscious that it was clearly like a negative perception of the Kamala campaign. I would have, radically run with it in the other direction at an earlier date. Had I been candidate Harris, whom I did not vote for, to be clear, I think I would have spent a lot more time thinking about what are the ways in which I can, if project a story of this campaign and of what the future of America could be that is a change from the present. Having said all that, the fact that she was not able, did not, nor it seems ever had the inclination to do anything that I just said, suggests that the way that the die was cast was simply how it had to go. That this was the very fruit of the exact kind of system that many, that the people criticize all the time, that is elite driven, non-responsive to the concerns of people, further down the food chain. I think that it was, the way it happened, it was bound to be that way because these are the crummy class of politicians that we have. The only kind of person who could have won in her position if you really think about it, would have been somebody with a moral imagination far vaster than I think most anybody in office really has on offer at the moment. In my essay, I made a comparison between the present moment and 1968, and I'm not the only person who's made this comparison. The person I know best who has made it quite forcefully is Seymour Hersh, the investigative journalist, who also incidentally broke the story of My Lai, and so he knows a little thing about that period of time, a thing or two anyway. But in 1968, there was the Vietnam War waged by a Democratic president. It was highly unpopular. There was a draft. The political salience of war abroad was extremely high. Eugene McCarthy, not a dove in the grand scheme of things, not an especially hyper-progressive guy, threw his hat in the ring, very nearly, as like almost on a lark to challenge the incumbent president, very nearly walked away with a win at the New Hampshire primary, and then all of a sudden, it was pretty clear to everybody that Lyndon Johnson, him running for re-election, was a big fat problem. So he said, I'm out. There was a primary. The Democrats opted not for the primary, which, by the way, in the case of 68, they almost won. Hubert Humphrey, who ended up being the nominee, very nearly beat Richard Nixon in 1968. In this situation, in 2024, we don't have that kind of... it wasn't so razor mark. The poetic comparison doesn't totally match. But what is important was that the dominant crisis within the Democratic Party in 68 was that there was a foreign policy decision within the broader of within the context of a larger national security doctrine. At that time, the Cold War. Now we can say the war on terror, our alliance to Israel, whatever. This larger framework that we are committed to, this larger set of ideals, and that was anathema to the base of the party. That simple. There was a foreign policy turd that the party was dragging around. And that's addressing it diplomatically, because in the case of Vietnam, it was obviously horrendous slaughter on an industrial scale, and that is also what we are dealing with in Gaza. One being committed by American troops and our proxies, whereas the other primarily our proxies. But the idea that the incumbent Democrat could kind of cheat their base on this, that they could sort of align in a position where they're going to promise social equality and all these other things at home while simultaneously engaging in, warmongering abroad, it wasn't a viable winning combination. I think, again, in 68 it was closer because of different political circumstances from that time than it was in 2024. But that fundamental contradiction, that idea that a Democratic president can run foreign policy as if his base did not give a shit about foreign policy, as if the base would not be dramatically deformed and disfigured or alienated by those kinds of decisions, I think that has been resoundingly proven true by the election of Trump. I do not believe, though, however, that as was the case in 68, that the Democrats will learn anything from it. Partly that's because Richard Nixon, by refusing to end the war in Vietnam and instead expanding it in his own way, he was able to take on the mantle as the object of everyone's hate. Even then when he won re-election in 72 and was bogged down in Watergate long after. I don't think that there is going to be, I don't think that the Republicans are going to be able to appropriate the policy in that kind of way. I think that people now have been really, and this is something that I would say is different from 68 in a way that's, worse for the Democratic Party, which is that I don't think that people who are disenchanted will come back to it, because the basis of their alienation from the politics is so much stronger, even if the moral crime and the implication of the individual America's involvement in that crime is much less visible or much less real. Americans aren't drafted into Israel, sure, but I think that the constant bombardment, again, and I use that word deliberately, of people with information about what it is that our government is supporting there, and the relative distance from the facts of that situation to the total indifference of the political class, that was something that did not exist in 60. I mean, Eugene McCarthy put his hat in the ring and run. There was no equivalent for this time around. Bernie didn't do it. Nobody Bernie aligned did it. You know, there was just Dean yeah, there was that one guy. You know, that was it. Yeah, I think that, you know, we have a political class now and a political elite and a media elite that are just far less responsive to popular discontent on this. And how that disenchantment shapes elections in the future, I don't know. There could always be another something like the Dobbs, you know, ruling, where people are motivated to turn out electorally for reasons that are unrelated to what disenchanted them in an earlier election. But yeah, it is hard for me to see how, you know, barring a kind of radical transformation of the Democratic Party that they have literally themselves never attempted, how it is that they're going to be able to position themselves as people doing something different to new voters or old voters or whatever. But that's their problem, not mine.